Thank you very much, Peter. That was extremely interesting. Our next speaker is Kishore Jayabalan, who is director of the Acton Institute, which is based in Rome and in Grand Forks, Michigan. The task of the Institute is to educate religious leaders in economics, which, given some recent remarks by the British Archbishop of Canterbury, is plainly uphill work. So it's going to be fascinating to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. The Archbishop of Canterbury is not one of our students. I'll just say that from the beginning. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak at this inaugural conference of the Danube Institute. The institute I work for, the Acton Institute, is named after Lord Acton, of course, the 19th century English historian, contemporary of Cardinal Newman, who very much promoted the idea of Christianity and liberty growing together. And we've taken that message and applied it to economic liberty, that Christianity and economic liberty are very much intertwined, even if at first glance they look to be opposing in many ways. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you know that Jesus said you cannot worship God and mammon. And mammon is very much the subject matter of the market and economics. So what is it going to be? And it's very much a crucial question, not just for religious-minded people, but also for anybody who's concerned about morality. And I think as human beings, it's an important question. So this is what we try to do. The office I work for in Rome is called Istituto Acton. Everybody wants to put an N in, but the Italians just say Istituto Acton. We're very glad to have another European partner battling for freedom and responsibility on the continent, because there are far too few of us doing so. And we try to make it apparent that this is not simply an American export, but we want Europeans themselves to recover their tradition and their heritage when it comes to freedom and responsibility. So John O'Sullivan has asked me to speak about the consequences of the financial crisis on religion, morality, and ruling ideas in 15 minutes. I could exhaust this topic in 15 days if I had to, but I will try for a quarter of an hour. We at the Acton Institute have a particular interest in the subject because, as was said, our mission is to educate religious leaders in free market economics. And the financial crisis is one area where there have been many myths that require the good kind of re-education. Now, because I have only 15 minutes, I'm going to focus on what Catholic religious leaders have said, not because I don't think other religions have their own important statements to say, but I think the Catholic understanding covers morality and ruling ideas as well for many parts of the world, including Europe. Again, it's not because everyone is Catholic and necessarily agrees with the teachings of the Catholic Church, but most religious leaders have similar concerns when it comes to public morality. And Catholic social doctrine tends to be a very intellectual endeavor. It's something that is supposed to be reasonable, that can be acceded to by people who don't even share the Catholic faith. So that's the reason I'm focusing on what Catholic teaching has to say. And of course, I work in Rome, and I used to work in the Vatican. So please forgive my Catholicism if it somehow prevents you from understanding what I'm trying to say, but I think it has universal appeal regardless. Now, the most notable consequence of the crisis on religion is that religious leaders have almost universally blamed the financial crisis on human greed, which is easy to understand. Greed is a sin, something which religious leaders understand far better than mortgage-backed securities or derivatives. More particularly, they have blamed the crisis on the greed of bankers who profited quite handsomely from the housing bubble and even the bailouts that came after the bubble burst. Priests and bishops in Latin America are especially prone to blame nefarious neoliberal forces for the crisis and what it has done to the rest of the world. Now, one of the most balanced statements, despite what John told us earlier about Cardinal Murphy O'Connor saying that capitalism is dead, a few months afterwards, on Christmas of 2008, now this is perhaps because the City of London is in its Archdiocese of Westminster, said the following, quote, "Christianity neither condemns nor canonizes the market economy. It may be an essential element in the conduct of human affairs. But we have to remember that it is a system governed by people, not some blind force like gravity. Those who operate the market have an obligation to act in ways that promote the common good, not just in ways that promote the interest of certain groups, unquote. As I said, somebody got to him from the City of London between the time he said capitalism was dead and the following statement. His successor in Westminster, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, quite soberly and accurately said the following, quote, "Rules become a lazy proxy for morality. People think that if it's not against some rule, it must be okay to do it. Such a society is inherently fragile. What is required beyond even ethical standards of conduct is a fundamental transformation of purpose, so that business and the financial sector in particular is seen by everyone as it should be, which is at the service of the rest of society. A change of language or of mission statements is not enough, and the risk of the language changing without credible reform is real," unquote. I'll also paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, the great English Catholic apologist, who said that if you get rid of the 10 Commandments, if you stop believing in them, you'll end up with 1,000 commandments, right? Not just 10, but 1,000 of them. Because once you lose that basic moral perspective, the tendency is to micromanage, to micro-regulate, and we've seen that's been the case, especially in Europe. All of this goes to show that living close to those who work in finance need not eliminate one's common or moral sense. But unfortunately, these kind of statements from religious leaders have been the exception rather than the rule. A second consequence of the crisis has been a depreciation of the benefits of economic globalization for the poor. According to many religious leaders, the interdependence of the global economy spread the risk undertaken by US banks and consumers to other countries. I think Michael Lewis put it best when he said, somebody can default on a mortgage payment in Florida and Iceland can go belly up as a result. Many of these religious leaders now think that there needs to be more national control over economic affairs. Of course, this is an old Marxist canard, and one that has utterly failed developing countries, and one which development economists have long since abandoned, but it remains in circulation among the economically ignorant. Take, for instance, this very recent example from a very influential cardinal, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Meradiaga of Honduras, who happens to be the head of this select group of 8 cardinals who are advising Pope Francis on the reform of the church. Here's what Cardinal Rodriguez said. "The effects and consequences of the neoliberal dictatorships that rule democracies are not hard to uncover. They invade us with the industry of entertainment. They make us forget about human rights. They convince us that nothing can be done, that there is no possible alternative. To change the system, it would be necessary to destroy the power of the new feudal lords. Chimerical, utopian, the church decidedly bets on living the globalization of mercy and solidarity," unquote. He said this in Dallas, Texas, no less. A third consequence has been that the financial crisis has somehow blinded religious leaders to the debt and entitlement crisis that is currently threatening virtually the entire Western world. It may be that many think the debts incurred to stabilize the financial system were worth the risk, and so are the ones undertaking to save the social contract. The term intergenerational solidarity is often heard in church circles, and is usually taken to mean that the young and old should not live at each other's expense. Fair enough. But I have yet to hear a religious leader speak about the dangers of leaving trillions of dollars of debt for future generations to pay off. It's as if the promises of the welfare state for pensions and healthcare benefits are sacrosanct, to be honored even if it bankrupts the nation and reduces opportunities for the young. But it should remember that the same religious leaders who favored increased social spending by the state also are the ones who talk about the social contract and these promises, even if it came at the expense of their own institutional charitable activities. You're seeing this in the United States with the pushback of the US bishops against Obamacare. For the first time in my understanding, the entire United States episcopacy is against the Obamacare mandate and what it does to Catholic hospitals. Every single bishop is against this. But it could be that the chickens have come home to roost for the US bishops who have long asked for increased social spending by the state. Now, what can be done to change the state of affairs among the religious-minded? First and foremost, religious leaders need to remember that greed is not the purview of a particular class or profession. There were greedy borrowers, to be sure, who wanted homes they couldn't afford, greedy politicians who wanted to expand their patronage of the poor, as well as greedy bankers. In fact, policies that required, as we heard this morning, banks to lend to the poor and minorities are what gave us subprime mortgages in the first place. So rather than limit greed to the rich, we need to see it as a human problem, one that may be exacerbated by a commercial society, but is not exclusive to it. Limiting certain sins to certain classes is an ideological way of looking at the problem of poverty. It's not very helpful to complain about unemployment while bashing job creators and innovators, as Pope Francis himself unfortunately did when he visited the Italian island of Sardinia. Where else are new jobs going to come from? If religious leaders are going to criticize the false idol of money, they also need to speak more forcefully and convincingly about what should replace it, namely God and what God wants from us. Thankfully, Pope Francis seems to have this part of the argument down and is very good at it. The second aspect would be to recognize that the problem of moral hazard that has been created by the bank bailouts, which is also related to the too big to fail problem inherent to cozy arrangements between big business and big government. Markets don't function when prices can't fluctuate, and businesses must be allowed to fail for making bad business decisions. I know this sounds like common sense, but unfortunately many of the people living in the social democratic states of Europe think that failure is not an option, that everybody must be above average. If banks big enough to have the political clout to get bailed out when they make bad loans and have bad assets, it only encourages more risk-taking, not less. Religious leaders ought to speak more about moral responsibility when it comes to borrowing as well as lending, consuming as well as producing, so that act and consequence, risk and reward are better aligned. Simply castigating financial capitalism or globalization is eventually bound to hurt the poor countries that need the investment the most to create business opportunities and wealth. Now, to me, that is one real serious negative consequence of the financial crisis. If we mean by globalization what we call international finance and international investment, the ones who will pay the price will be the poor. And as long as Pope Francis has this great media image at the moment, it's largely due to his being unified with the poor, to saying he wants a poor church for the poor. And what we're trying to add to the discussion is that you also need to have investment in capital for the poor as a sign of justice. Third, religious leaders need to find ways to address the debt and entitlement crisis in ways that don't place the burdens of the current generation on future ones. This is a moral crisis as much as an actuarial one, and made worse by falling birth rates, which religious leaders are very concerned about. Of course, not all debt is bad. If it were, all finance would be bad too. But excessive debt is a sign of self-indulgence and greed in its own right. In the end, the financial crisis has many facets that are very complicated to sort out, as we've heard this morning. Too complicated for non-specialists and maybe even for specialists as well to understand completely. But one thing is clear: the moral and technical aspects of economics are intertwined. In 1985, the future Pope Benedict XVI gave one of the very few talks he ever gave on the church and economics, in which he spoke about the moral problem of separating the subjective and objective realms of knowledge. He concluded his talk by saying the following, quote, A morality that believes itself able to dispense with the technical knowledge of economic laws is not morality, but moralism. As such, it is the antithesis of morality. A scientific approach that believes itself capable of managing without an ethos misunderstands the reality of man. Therefore, it is not scientific. Today, we need a maximum of specialized economic understanding, but also a maximum of ethos, so that specialized economic knowledge may enter the service of the right goals. Only in this way will this knowledge be both politically practicable and socially tolerable, unquote. It is no accident that it was the same Pope who spoke of the dictatorship of relativism upon his election to the chair of St. Peter 20 years ago. As an human endeavor, 20 years later, 1985 is when he talked about the church and economics, and 20 years later he was elected Pope. As a human endeavor, finance cannot avoid morality. Finance is a fundamental part of economics, which is a fundamental part of politics, which ultimately concerns the truth about man and how we live together. Getting this order wrong is when things fall apart. Religious leaders, at least, have been right about this. Thank you.